Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, where the past comes gently knocking, not with horns and drums, but with the soft shuffle of worn boots down cobblestone streets, and the whisper of history beneath flickering torchlight. Here we don't rush through timelines or roar through conquests. Instead we slow down. We wander through the forgotten alleys, the dusty halls, the cold watchtowers, and the quiet corners of human experience, especially the parts no one dares to romanticize. Tonight you'll step into the heavy boots of someone history rarely honors, a medieval town watchman, armed with nothing but a cudgel, a lantern, and your name likely to be forgotten. You'll walk the same winding lanes each night, braving cold winds, disease, and men more dangerous than wolves. This is not a tale of knights or kings. This is a story about the ones who stood between chaos and what little peace medieval life allowed and paid the price for it. So tuck yourself in, let the candlelight flicker. The hour grows late, and the past is waiting. Chapter 1. The Graveyard Shift. A watchman's daily hell. If you ever romanticized the life of a medieval town, with its candlelit streets and distant chapel bells, allow me to gently snuff out that illusion. The real medieval night stank, it crawled, it hissed, and walking through it was one man's miserable duty, the town watchman. There were no street lamps, no warm cloaks provided by a caring city, no comfortable posts to lean against. A town watchman stepped into the gloom wrapped in wool soaked from the previous rain, gripping a cudgel slick with age, his breath steaming into blackness so dense it could smother a candle. The only light came from a flickering lantern, its oil mixed with animal fat, its smell lingering on his coat longer than sleep ever did. Most towns had no formal police force. Instead, local men were conscripted into rotating shifts of night patrol. For some it was civic duty, for many it was forced labor. Refusing meant fines or beatings. Being poor meant your name came up more often. And so the same shivering souls were marched out again and again to guard the very streets where they'd nearly starved the day before. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. You've been walking since sunset. You're assigned the East Quarter, an area near the tannery and the pig pens. The stench alone would make a lesser man retch. The cobbles beneath your boots are slick with waste, not just pig waste, but human. Chamber pots were emptied from windows above without warning. And if you were lucky, it missed your head. If not, your night just got even longer. You're not armed like a knight. No sword, no armor, just a club and maybe a rusty knife tucked into your belt if you're lucky, or paranoid. Your job is to look for criminals, but most of them are stronger than you and many are better paid. Thieves often had guilds that protected them. You had the city's thanks, which meant nothing and bought even less. Worse still, no one liked the watchman. You were not the beloved protector of peace. You were the man who interrupted backroom dealings, broke up drunken fights, or caught someone sneaking home past curfew. You were the interruption of pleasure and vice. People hated you for doing your job, and if you failed to do it, they hated you even more. And yes, there were curfews, real ones. Town gates were shut tight at night, and any soul caught wandering without good reason was questioned, beaten or imprisoned. That included travelers, peasants, midwives, even priests. The darkness was feared, and rightfully so, because what crept through it was not always human. Wild dogs roamed the alleys, wolves sometimes prowled the outskirts. More than one watchman was found mauled, half-eaten by morning, the only trace of him a splintered cudgel and footprints fading into the woods. But that wasn't the scariest thing. Fires, wooden homes, thatched roofs, no chimneys. Any spark could destroy half a town before sunrise. Watchmen were expected to sniff the air like bloodhounds, searching for the first trace of smoke. If they found a fire, they had to raise the hue and cry, banging on doors, ringing bells, shouting until bleary-eyed citizens emerged with buckets or rugs. And if they failed, they were blamed, punished, sometimes whipped. In Norwich, England, records from the 14th century show that one watchman was publicly flogged for failing to report a fire in time, even though the blaze started after his shift had ended. Justice had little to do with truth. It was about control, and the watchman was always within reach. Let's not forget the weather. Winter was brutal. Frostbite took fingers, wet leather froze to the skin. In 1315, during the Great Famine, reports from Bruges mention watchmen collapsing from hunger mid-patrol. They were found the next morning, curled in doorways like dogs, their eyes frozen open. Sleep? Forget it. A night shift wasn't followed by rest. The next morning a watchman might be called to testify, clean up messes from overnight brawls, or help haul a corpse from the river. A good day meant going home with all your teeth. A great day meant someone offered you broth or bread out of pity. And yet, despite the suffering, the role never disappeared. Towns needed their watch, because when everyone else was asleep, someone had to be out there, watching the dark, breathing the filth, Hearing the whispers of crime in the shadows, someone had to be the first to scream when death came knocking. So next time you see an old manuscript or a medieval woodcut with a man in a cloak carrying a lantern, don't be fooled. That wasn't a hero. That was the tired, terrified, half-starved man keeping the town from falling apart while the rest of the world slept in comfort, and no one ever remembered his name. The weight of the watchman's job didn't come from the cudgel he carried or the armor he lacked. It came from the silence. Not peaceful silence, the kind that clawed at your ears and made your skin tight, the kind that wasn't empty but pregnant with threats, creaking shutters, soft scuffles in the hay, distant screams that no one investigated. Most nights, the stillness of medieval streets wasn't comforting, it was unnerving, because it meant either trouble was brewing or something had already gone terribly wrong. And when things did go wrong, you had no one to rely on. The medieval watchman didn't have a partner or backup. Patrols were often solo, especially in poorer towns or during thin seasons like winter and famine. Some places used rotating pairs, but those were rare and unreliable. Men often skipped their shift, leaving their partner to handle the full route alone. Complaining, not an option. You'd be fined for dereliction, not the other guy. And besides, who would you report it to? The same magistrates who didn't pay you on time, the same ones who used the watch as scapegoats when crime statistics rose. Most of what we know about town watchmen doesn't come from statues or stories. It comes from complaints in court rolls, fines and punishment records. In 1322, a watchman in Coventry was accused of sleeping on duty. He claimed he had walked all night the day before during a fire outbreak, and had collapsed from exhaustion. No mercy was shown. He was fined and dismissed. The town's defense was simple. The town must be guarded. Let the man die upright, not lying down. Let that sink in. This was the general attitude. You were there to absorb trouble, like a sponge made of bone and nerves, and if you cracked, the town would toss you aside and find another man poor enough to take your place. Because the position of watchman wasn't permanent, it rotated frequent. One day you could be cleaning fish for a merchant, the next you'd be walking through back alleys armed with nothing but bad luck. That rotation also meant inconsistency. There were no formal training programs, no manuals, no rules beyond keep order. Some towns scribbled rough guidelines, but enforcement varied wildly. In fact, many crimes committed during the night were enabled by the watchmen themselves, either through ignorance, corruption or sheer fear. Yes, corruption. Let's not pretend the watchman was safe. After all, what do you expect from a man who's overworked, underfed and constantly threatened? Bribes became survival tactics. A few coins slipped from a smuggler's hand meant one less night of hunger. Turning a blind eye to a tavern fight avoided a cracked skull. It was often safer and smarter to pretend you didn't see anything at all. And who would care if you did? The courts rarely believed the testimony of watchmen. Their words were treated as low value, especially if they accused a merchant, or no. Trials were a performance, and the poor had no speaking parts. The best a watchman could hope for was to make it through unnoticed. Every so often, a watchman tried to do the right thing. He'd arrest a known thief, or stop a tavern stab, but without legal protection, the aftermath was brutal. The criminal might be back on the street in days, vengeful, armed and looking for payback. The watchman had no guardhouse to retreat to, no badge to wave for protection. He was just another man on the street wearing the same threadbare coat as everyone else. And then there were the festivals. You might think those were easier nights. Joy, dancing, public celebration, but for a watchman, they were hell on earth. Festivals meant drinking, crowds, chaos. Drunken brawls erupted like sparks from a forge. Young men tested their strength and masculinity by attacking the watch. Women were groped in the shadows, stalls were robbed while their owners danced, and bonfires became excuses to burn more than just wood. One famous account from 1390 London tells of a watchman who tried to stop a group of young revelers from harassing a merchant's daughter. They turned on him, beat him senseless, and dumped him in the Thames. No arrests were made. The merchant's daughter married a nobleman 2 months later. The watchman's body was never recovered. Even the tools of the job were pathetic. The lanterns used for night patrol were prone to going out in wind or rain. The cudgel, typically a thick stick of ash or oak, was useless against blades or mobs. And armor? Forget. The cost of a single mail shirt could exceed an entire year's wage. Most watchmen had leather caps or old helmets salvaged from battlefields, more symbolic than practical. Then there were the sounds that kept a man from sleep long after the shift ended. The sobs of a woman locked in a pillory, the gurgle of a dying thief clutching his stomach, the slam of a jail door, the whimper of a child caught wandering after dark, confused and alone, all of it echoing in your ears long after the morning bell rang. Some watchmen went mad, not in the screaming, frothing way but in the quiet withdrawal that came from too many nights staring into darkness. They started hearing things, seeing things, a shadow behind every corner, a footstep that followed too long. In towns like Ghent and York, there are cases of watchmen found muttering in corners, refusing to go out again, their minds frayed beyond repair. And yet they kept coming, because someone always needed the money, because every town needed watchers, even if it didn't care about. So next time you imagine a medieval town as charming or rustic, try instead to see it through the eyes of the man who walked it night after night, soaked in cold, bruised by law and crime alike, and utterly forgotten the moment the sun rose. The town may have slept, but he never truly did. Chapter 2: Rats, Rogues, and Rotten Streets. The medieval street was not a place you wanted to linger. By day it was chaotic, by night it was a nightmare stitched together from mud, blood and shadow. While we might think of the town watchman's task as noble, guarding the citizens, preventing theft, ensuring public safety, the truth is grimmer. His duty was less about justice, and more about survival, his own, and barely that. Let's talk about what the watchman walked through. Literal streets weren't paved in most medieval towns. They were trodden earth or loose cobblestones, warped and sunken by years of carts and livestock. Add in human and animal waste, thrown from windows or dropped in the middle of the path, and you had a sludge that could swallow a man's boot. The stench of rot was constant, especially in warmer months, when heat baked the mess into a thick, throat-clogging vapor. Now imagine doing your job in this. Your patrol route might take you through the butcher's quarter, where animal blood formed rivulets beside your feet, congealing near the curb, or past the tanner's yard, where vats of dog dung and stale urine used to soften hides, festered in open pit. Even in winter the scent was unbearable. In summer, it was enough to make a man retch and weep. And then came the rats, not cute, storybook rodents, but thick-bodied disease vessels. They scurried in packs, fought over offal and weren't afraid of men. Watchmen had to kick them out of the way or endure them brushing across their ankles in the dark. You could swing your cudgel at one, but another 5 would scatter behind you. They lived in walls, in gutters, in the bodies left to rot when the city couldn't afford burial. You see, most towns had poor sanitation infrastructure, few had working drainage, fewer still had covered sewers, waste pooled in alleys and under floorboards. The water from public wells was often contaminated, and yet people still drank from it. What else could they do? Water fetched from the river often carried corpses downstream or industrial runoff from mills. Some towns imposed rules about where waste could be dumped, but who enforced it? The watchman. And who listened? Almost no one. The night patrol's job was to fine or punish offenders, but they rarely had the power. A baker dumping doughy scrap behind his stall could claim ignorance. A noble's servant flinging pig guts into the gutter, untouchable. And if you insisted on carrying out your duty, you might find yourself reassigned, dismissed or beaten. There are records of watchmen in 15th century Paris, who tried to fine tavern owners for throwing waste into the street, and were later found beaten outside the city walls. No arrests were made. The taverns stayed open. Crime thrived in these conditions, not just because the streets were dark and filthy, but because they were crowded and untraceable. Towns were tightly packed, walls pressed close, and visibility was poor even in daylight. At night, unless the moon was full, you might not see more than a few paces ahead. A thief could stab you and vanish into a side alley before your eyes even registered movement. And the crimes weren't just petty theft, banditry, rape, extortion. These weren't rare. They were expected. Night was when grudges got settled and debts were repaid in blood. Prostitutes worked the corners, some willingly, some under threat. Fights broke out without warning, knives flashed in lantern light, and all of it was the watchman's problem, not to fix it, but to witness it, and survive. Even when criminals were caught, justice was a gamble. Trials were public spectacles, not pathways to truth. A watchman's testimony was rarely enough. Witnesses could be bribed. Judges were often corrupt. Some towns relied on trial by ordeal, burning the accused's hand or making them walk through fire. If they healed quickly, they were innocent. If not, they were guilty. Either way, your role as the arresting officer was just one bad verdict away from retaliation. And if you think the townsfolk supported the watchman, think again. Most saw him as an inconvenience, a walking curfew, a man too poor to be a merchant, and too cowardly to be a soldier. Children threw pebbles at him. Drunks mocked him. Housewives cursed him for waking the baby when he shouted the time at midnight, a tradition meant to prove he was still alive and doing his rounds. Oh yes, that was real. In many towns, the watchman was required to cry the hour as he passed each quarter. 3 o'clock and all is well. They'd bellow into the blackness, sometimes hoarse, sometimes hollow, but not always honest, because rarely was all well. Fires smoldered in chimneys, smugglers crept under the docks, men bled behind taverns, but saying so wouldn't fix anything, and staying silent was easier. One of the worst parts was that no one ever taught you how to handle these horrors. There was no training for facing a crowd of angry townsfolk accusing a traveler of witchcraft. No guidebook for dealing with a nobleman's son caught mid-assault. Do you intervene and risk your life, or look away and hope someone else carries the burden? Either choice left a scar. Many towns tried to improve things by building stocks and pillories, public punishments to deter crime, but these were spectacles too. People laughed and threw filth at the pun. The watchman often had to escort the accused to the scaffold, listen to their begging, their crying, sometimes their vomiting, and still return to his route that night, as if none of it had happened. So when you imagine a medieval watchman standing tall, lantern raised against the dark, remember this: he wasn't just battling criminals, he was wading through a sea of filth, fear and futility. His job wasn't noble, it was nauseating, and he did it because someone had to, or because he had no choice. The deeper one looks into the medieval city, the clearer it becomes that the urban ecosystem wasn't just harsh, it was actively hostile. And yet within this hostile world, the watchman walked nightly like an exposed nerve, expected to sense danger before it struck, deter crime before it erupted, and absorb blame for anything that slipped through the cracks. One of the more overlooked threats in this filthy ecosystem, disease. The Black Death gets all the attention, but medieval towns festered with illness even in healthy years. Leprosy, dysentery, typhoid and smallpox were all common, and in every case, the spread began in the same place, the street. Slop buckets dumped beside market stalls, dead cats curled beneath carts, and pools of still water swarming with mosquitoes, all of it baked beneath a sun that cared nothing for sanitation. It was desperation. If someone collapsed near the bakery with black boils on their neck, the nearest patrolling watchman might be asked, begged or ordered to drag the body to the edge of town. He might be told to burn the clothes, or worse, burn the person alive or dead. In times of panic, rumors spread faster than plague, and the watchman stood between the mob and its target. Some towns used plague flags, marking infected homes with red crosses, or black cloth. And who had to enforce the lockdown? You guessed it, the watchman. No payment, no protection, just instructions to stand outside the door, ensure no one left, and report back if someone died. It was a death sentence disguised as duty. One tragic record comes from Milan in 1431, where a watchman was assigned to stand guard outside a merchant's home known to be infected. After 3 days with no food or replacement, he broke protocol and went inside to ask for water. The merchant's son, barely 16, coughed once, just once, and within a week, both were dead. The replacement watchman, sent to the same door, no questions. But even outside of plagues, food poisoning ran rampant. Meat spoiled quickly without refrigeration, milk curdled, fish, stored in salt, often went rancid anyway, and yet markets thrived on quantity over quality. If a customer dropped dead after eating moldy bread or bad oysters, it was the watchman's job to locate the seller, assuming he hadn't already fled, and haul them before the magistrate. If the seller was popular or connected, the watchman was accused of overreaching. If the seller was poor, punishment was swift, sometimes public whipping, sometimes imprisonment. Either way, the watchman's hands were stained by proxy. And then there were the guilds. Guilds were supposed to regulate trades: blacksmiths, bakers, butchers, cobblers. In theory, they upheld quality and fair prices. In practice, many operated like cartels. If a member was caught cheating or stealing, guild masters might pressure the watch to ignore the offense. A watchman who defied them could find himself blacklisted, unable to find honest work, refused service at markets, even harassed by guild enforcers. One London record from the early 15th century mentions a watchman who attempted to expose a corrupt baker selling underweight loaves. Days later, his rented room was ransacked. His patrol route was accidentally redirected to a dangerous riverside path. Weeks later, he disappeared entirely. Watchmen lived precariously on edge, underpaid, overused. They often had no stable income. Their wages were sometimes withheld, delayed, or paid in kind, bread, grain, or cloth, instead of coin. If they protested, they were replaced. If they died, they were quickly forgotten. Their families received nothing: no pensions, no memorials, no gravestones. And if you think they found peace during the day, think again. The noise never stopped. Carts rumbled, hammers rang, bells clanged for mass or market, children screamed, livestock bellowed. The town never truly slept, and the few hours of rest a watchman got were usually interrupted by disputes, requests, summons, or sometimes just the overwhelming stink wafting through their window. Many watchmen drank heavily,
not for recreation but to dull the edges of their reality. Al was safer than water, and strong spirits numbed the body and mind. Some towns tried banning watchmen from drinking on duty, but enforcement was laughable. In York, a set of regulations from 1389 declares, "No night watchman shall be inebriated while upon the route, nor shall he lie down upon the job." The very existence of such a rule proves how often it was broken. Still, even drunk, the watchman walked, because not walking meant punish, because towns needed their nightman, not to protect them but to absorb their guilt, their filth, their fear. He was the pressure valve of the medieval city, and when that valve broke, violence spilled. There are records of entire watches being massacred during riot. In 1377, during a bread riot in Rouen, the watch was blamed for price gouging. Despite having no control over the grain supply, several were dragged from their posts and thrown into the Seine. In 1405, a group of night guards in Prague were mistaken for government spies and stabbed to death by angry merchants. Their bodies were left in the street until morning, when city officials finally arrived, not to help, but to record who owed whom compensation. They weren't even missed. If one died, another would be assigned. If none volunteered, the poorest men in town were forced to serve or fined, and if all else failed, orphans were sometimes trained for the job. Boys barely old enough to hold a lantern, much less face a dagger. It was a job built on disposability, and yet night after night, the role endured, because in the festering, rotting streets of the medieval town, even a half-blind man with a bent stick was better than nothing. He didn't bring safety, he didn't bring justice, he just walked through mud, through disease, through hatred, and in doing so, held back the collapse, just a little longer.
Chapter 3. The bell toll at midnight. There was a sound in the medieval town that could chill a man to the bone. It wasn't the scream of a woman, nor the crash of wood splitting under force. It was something far quieter, yet far heavier. The toll of the midnight bell. To the average citizen, it marked a new day. For the watchman, it was a warning. Midnight was when the veil between order and anarchy grew thinnest. The drunks grew violent, the thieves emboldened, and every creature of the dark, man or beast, began to stir with purpose. This was the hour when a watchman needed his nerves most. Unlike the clean chimes we might imagine from modern towers, medieval bells were raw, metallic, and crude. They echoed through stone and bone alike, making dogs howl and mothers clutch their children closer. In some towns, bells rang not from a central steeple but from makeshift iron clappers atop wooden poles. Tools of noise, not art. Each strike bounced off damp walls and twisted through the alleys like a ghost calling out for blood. And blood often answered. The bell signaled the start of the darkest shift. Night watchmen patrolled long before midnight, of course. But this hour marked a shift in atmosphere, less crowded, more dangerous. By now those with homes were asleep. Those without were either freezing in corners or moving like shadows through the lanes. A watchman, lantern in hand, would step past shuttered homes and try to listen past the echoes. You had to train your ears to distinguish between wind and whisper, between a creaking signboard and a door being opened with intent. It was less about sight, there was barely any, and more about instinct. Good watchmen smelled trouble before they saw it. A sudden silence where street dogs should bark. A puff of candlelight behind a boarded window. The crunch of hurried steps that stopped the moment you did. One mistake could cost your life. Thieves in the medieval world were not like romantic outlaws from fables. They were brutal, desperate, and well organized. In many towns, professional thieves formed gangs. They mapped the routes of watchmen, bribed local vendors, and knew the weak spots in the wall. Some used children as distractions, pickpockets, and runners who could vanish through gaps no adult could follow. And if you caught one, you had to survive the others. A lone thief rarely acted alone. That was suicide. Most carried knives, clubs, or jagged tools repurposed for violence. Some used sharpened bones or hammers intended for cobblers. A watchman had a cudgel, usually a thick stick of oak, and little else. He wasn't allowed to wear military weapons. Armor was too expensive, and even if you wore chainmail, it did little to stop a stab in the neck from behind. In certain towns like Lubeck and Bruges, there were recorded gangs who deliberately hunted the watch. They saw it as sport. Young men, drunk or cruel or both, waited in shadows to ambush night patrols, testing their strength, mocking their fear, humiliating them before letting them crawl back bruised and broken. Some didn't make it back. There's a record from 1424 London. A watchman named Alric was patrolling near a fishmonger's alley when he was attacked by 3 men. No motive was ever confirmed. His body was found the next morning, his cudgel snapped in two, his lantern shattered beside him, his hands frozen mid-defensive pose. No arrests were made. The city declared it the cost of guarding freedom. Freedom. That's what the towns said they were protecting. But at midnight, freedom smelled like blood and sounded like boots running away. Beyond thieves, Watchmen also faced fires. The midnight curse of every medieval town. Without electricity or stone construction, homes burned easily. A tipped candle, an overloaded hearth. Even a spark from wall on wall could ignite a blaze. By midnight, fires were most likely. People had fallen asleep, hearths left untended, and no one would notice until it was too late. Watchmen were instructed to look for smoke, to feel the air for warmth, to sniff like dogs, and if a fire was found, they were to raise the alarm, loudly, banging on doors, ringing bells, screaming fire until others woke. But here's the catch. If you were too slow and someone died, you could be blamed. Not the builder, not the homeowner, the watchman. The watchman. In 1381, a blaze in a bakery in Dijon spread to 2 entire streets. Dozens died. The watchman on duty claimed he had shouted until he went hoarse, but no one heard, or no one cared. He was fined, beaten, and imprisoned. When he died 6 months later, his death wasn't even recorded. Just a note, replacement required for night watch route. Yes, the medieval man feared witches, spirits, demons, and yes, the watchman was expected to deal with these too. If someone was found walking naked through the streets muttering prayers backward, he was to be If livestock were found slaughtered in strange patterns, the watchman was summoned. If a child vanished, it was his job to lead the search, even if it meant digging through cesspits or dark woods. Watchmen were not trained for this. They were not priests or healers, but fear was stronger than logic. If someone died under strange circumstances, suspicion fell first on the last man seen nearby. Often the watchman accusations flew quickly in darkness. In 1449, in a German town near the Harz Mountains, a watchman was blamed for summoning spirits after 3 children went missing. No proof was found, but he was burned anyway because fear demanded a flame. So when you hear the idea of a midnight shift and imagine solitude and reflection, know this: the medieval version was no quiet meditation. It was a battle between man and shadow, between what was seen and what was heard, and between what was fair and what was cruel. The bell toll at midnight didn't just mark time, it marked the moment when everything the watchman feared was most likely to strike. By now the average watchman had learned a cruel lesson: midnight was less of a threshold and more of an invitation. An invitation for everything civilized society pretended didn't exist. The bell tolled, and with it came a parade of whispered threats, hidden knives, and creeping dread that couldn't be lit away by any lantern. But what made the midnight shift so dangerous wasn't always physical. It was psychological, the weight of knowing you were utterly alone. Despite the ideal of a rotating patrol system, most night shifts were solitary. In cities with thousands of citizens, the total watchmen numbered in the tens, sometimes fewer. Their patrols were spread thin, covering streets that twisted and turned like the veins of a beast determined to bleed you dry. Some routes took 2 hours to complete. Others forced the watchman to cross bridges, scale narrow stairs, and pass under looming balconies where criminals or debris or worse might rain down. The mental toll was relentless. Every time your boots splashed in something warm, your heart skipped. Was it water, blood, or sewage? Every time a cat shrieked in the distance, your pulse raced. Was it just a fight between strays, or a woman screaming in a locked cellar? The air itself seemed to hum with malice. You began to imagine eyes watching you from behind boarded windows, or from the cracks in crumbling stone. And if you paused too long in your fear, that too was a risk. You see, medieval towns didn't just employ watchmen, they judged them constantly. Delay on your patrol route, fined. Fail to report suspicious activity, punished. Accused of cowardice by a citizen, investigate. These weren't optional shifts. You weren't just a hired guard. You were a moving piece of the town's fragile image of order, an image constantly under threat by everything the bell at midnight stirred into motion. There was a strange rule in parts of France during the 14th century. Any watchman who walked more than 15 minutes late on his assigned loop could be replaced without question. The assumption: if you were late, you were drunk, lazy, or dead. All three in practice were equally inconvenient to the council. Some towns made it worse. In Cologne there were challenge points, specific intersections where a watchman had to recite a memorized phrase when passing another patrol. If he failed due to panic, exhaustion, or even a coughing fit, he was suspected of being an imposter or traitor.
This led to tragic misidentifications. In one case, 2 watchmen stabbed each other fatally in confusion. Both were found gripping their bloodied cudgels. The city quietly removed the rule later that year. Let's not forget that many cities still punished by public execution. Gallows weren't hidden. They were in the town square or just outside the gates. Constant reminders of the price of chaos. Night watchmen often walked right past these sites. In winter, bodies froze and stayed hanging for weeks. In summer, the stench spread for miles. Crows picked the eyes out. Rats gnawed the feet. The watchmen walked on. Sometimes they were ordered to guard the corpses from tampering. Superstitions claimed hanged men could return if their bodies were desecrated by witches or thieves. So the watchmen stood below the swaying feet of the executed, listening to the creak of the rope and the squawk of carrion birds. One breath too deep, and he'd taste one shift too long and he'd lose sleep for weeks. Add to this the twisted logic of collective punishment. If a crime occurred and no culprit was found, guess who suffered? The nearest watchman. Floggings weren't accusations of negligence or collusion were leveled at the very men walking the beat. In 1358 in Naples, a series of midnight thefts rocked the textile district. No one was caught, so the city council publicly beat all 7 night patrolmen responsible for the area. One died 2 days later. His replacement began work the next evening. And the irony, despite all this effort, the watch was often completely ineffective. Crime wasn't reduced. Fires still broke out. Bodies still appeared in wells or behind stables. Citizens often distrusted the watch more than they feared the criminals. Why? Because of the inconsistency. One watchman might ignore a brawl out of fear. Another might beat a man senseless for walking without a torch. The law varied not by book, but by mood, weather and yet for all its failures, the system persisted, because the idea of control was more important than control itself. And so the midnight bell tolled again, and again, and again. With each toll a watchman stepped into the void, not for justice, not for glory, but because the town needed anyone to walk the darkness and pretend it could be managed. Some tried to ease the burden. In certain cities, watchmen formed silent bonds, passing food, sharing routes, warning each other of danger. A piece of salted pork, a scribbled map of escape alleys there, small kindnesses to ease the load, but it wasn't enough. Most lasted weeks, not months. Those who stayed longer hardened into quiet shadows of themselves. Men who didn't flinch when they found a body, who no longer recoiled at bone or blood, who stopped asking questions when a nobleman's cart passed by with its canvas stained red. They simply walked. The bell tolled and they walked, because that was the only rule the town respected. No matter what happened, who died, who vanished, who burned, there must be a watchman walking at midnight, even if no one remembered his name, even if no one. Chapter 4. The drunken nobles and untouchable elites. There was a hierarchy in medieval towns, one more powerful than the law, louder than the church bell, and crueler than any thief. It was the hierarchy of power, and for the watchman the real danger wasn't the knife in the alley or the fire in the bakery. It was the nobleman's smirk, because in a world where justice was claimed to be blind, the elite made sure it had one eye open, and it always looked away when they were involved. The town watchman, by contrast, had both eyes open. He had to, not just to catch criminals, but to survive the whims of the men who considered themselves above the law. These were the sons of landed knights, merchants who bribed their way into council seats, and clergy who cloaked lust and greed in incense and Latin. And every single one of them knew that if they broke the law, the watchman would be the one punished for noticing. Imagine you're walking the midnight route through the upper quarter. The streets here are better paved, the buildings taller, the windows cleaner. It's supposed to be the safest part of town, and then you hear it. Laughter. Loud, sloppy, the kind that signals danger, not joy. You turn the corner and see them, a group of young nobles, cloaked in velvet, wine-drunk and flushed, kicking over barrels and tossing coins at a servant they've tied to a post. You step closer. Your duty is clear. Public disturbance, unlawful detainment, possible assault. But as your lantern light catches their faces, they look up, and they recognize you not as an authority but as entertainment. One saunters over, wine dribbling from his lip, and calls you guard dog. Another mocks your patched coat. A third, silent but cold-eyed, fingers the hilt of his dagger and smiles. You could say something. You could invoke the town statutes, but they know what you know. Nothing will happen to them. If you lay a hand on them, even in defense, you'll be dismissed, fined, or jailed. They will claim you attacked first. Their servants will back them. Their fathers will pay off the judge. And the townspeople will whisper, not in outrage, but relief that it wasn't their child who got in the way of the elite. This wasn't rare. Nobles, especially the younger ones, considered the watchman an obstacle at best, a punching bag at worst. During feast days their carousing spilled into the streets, brothels were visited, often violently, inns were trashed, servants were borrowed, and if anyone tried to stop the blame always fell down the ladder, never up. In 1413, a case in Ghent recorded a group of noblemen who raced horses through the main market square at midnight, knocking over carts and injuring 2 vendors. The watchman who tried to stop them was struck in the face with a goblet. When he reported the incident, he was accused of impeding the joy of the feast, and fined for public disruption. The noblemen sent a bottle of wine to the court in apology, and were forgiven. The elites moved through the town like ghosts, visible, loud, untouchable. They hosted clandestine duels in courtyards, held drunken contests in churchyards, and demanded watchmen escort their mistresses home on foot, in silence and without complaint. Refusal was insubordination, acceptance meant complicity. Either way the watchman lost. And don't assume this abuse came only from youth. Older nobles wielded their authority with icy precision. A watchman who arrested a servant could be summoned to a manor the next day, and interrogated, "Why did you touch my man? Did you enjoy humiliating him? Do you think yourself above your station?" The message was always clear: stay in your place. But perhaps the most humiliating task came with escorting drunken lords home. Yes, it was often the watchman's job to make sure a noble didn't fall into a ditch or get robbed while stumbling from one brothel to another. You were not allowed to speak, unless spoken to. You were expected to walk behind, like a servant, but close enough to catch them if they slipped. And when they did, you were blamed for letting them drink too much, for not stopping them from slipping, for being present at all. Some towns attempted to curb this abuse. In 1435, the city of Florence passed a law stating that no man of title shall lay hand upon a watchman in the performance of his duty. But enforcement was a joke. The very people meant to uphold it were kin to the offenders. When a noble struck a guard in Venice during Carnival, the man's father, the local magistrate, fined him 1 ducat, then invited the injured watchman to a feast. To show goodwill, the invitation was declined. The watchman disappeared 2 days later. Even in death, the noble remained protected. If a watchman was found murdered near a lord's estate, it was robbery. If the last people seen with him were squires or heirs, the case was dropped for lack of evidence. One record from 1399 tells of a watchman who reported a noble's illegal dogfights. Days later he was found hanged from a city gate. The verdict: suicide. The watchman's family was fined for burying him without permission. Some elites used the watch for sport. There were whispers in taverns of hunts, where bored nobles would dress in black, roam the poorer quarters, and ambush watchmen just for the thrill. They wore masks, used blunted weapons, and left their victims bruised but alive usually. Complaints were dismissed as fantasy, but the bruises were real, the fear, realer still. So the next time you imagine a brave watchman striding into danger, remember he wasn't chasing justice, he was dodging power. Because the greatest threat in the medieval city wasn't the criminal in the alley, it was the noble on the balcony watching with wine in hand and laughter on his breath.
Chapter 6. The festering wounds of plague duty. It wasn't the sword or the thief or the riot that medieval watchmen feared most. It was the silence, thick and sudden, the kind that came before the cartwheels squeaked down the lane and someone whispered, "Another one." Because when the plague came, and it always came eventually, the night watchman wasn't just the keeper of order. He became the last man standing between the living and the dying. And the dead did not go quietly. Outbreaks in medieval towns didn't begin with proclamations or official warnings. They began with a smell. A child who didn't wait. A man who coughed blood into his breakfast. A butcher's apprentice whose legs turned black overnight. The signs were fast, brutal, unmistakable. And once they appeared, fear took root in the cobbles, the wells, and the air itself. The town council's response was always the same: lock down, contain, quarantine. And who enforced it? The watchman. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't brave. It was forced. Orders were issued quickly, often handwritten and barely legible, posted at gates or shouted in Latin no one understood. All town gates shut. Travel banned, public gatherings cancelled, and for every street marked with a red cross, a watchman was assigned. His job: make sure no one went in, and more importantly, that no one came out. He stood alone, armed with only a cudgel and a scrap of parchment that named the house inside as afflicted. He wasn't given gloves. He wasn't given masks. Those didn't exist. If he was lucky, he tied a soaked rag around his mouth, doused in vinegar or piss, whatever he believed might keep the bad air at bay. Most nights, he stood for hours outside a door behind which entire families screamed, cried, or fell silent. And when the door did open, it was never good. Sometimes the inhabitants tried to flee, a mother clutching a child, a desperate father offering coin, a fevered youth swaying on trembling legs. The watchman had to stop them, push them back, threaten, beg. Once in Lubeck, a watchman was stabbed in the leg by a woman who tried to break quarantine after her infant died. He bled for hours. No physician came. No one would touch him. Other times no one opened the door. Not for hours, not for days. And that meant the watchman had to go in. There was no training for this. No ceremony. Just a knock, a creak, and the smell sweet, wet, choking. He stepped inside with his lantern shaking. The light flickered across faces contorted by death. Bodies curled into corners, rats crawling across blankets. Sometimes he found someone alive. More often he found the end. Then came the next task, disposal. Most towns didn't have enough grave diggers during plague years. So guess who filled the gap? The watchman. With rope, burlap and raw hands, he dragged corpses from homes and alleys and stables. They were loaded onto carts already wet with blood and bile, wheeled through silent streets toward mass graves dug outside the city walls. The carts were not sealed, the bodies were not wrapped. Arms hung over the sides, jaws lolled open. Sometimes the dead moaned, gases, escaping the belly, tricking the mind into thinking they still lived. And the living, they watched through cracks in shutters covering their mouths, praying it wasn't their home next. They never thanked the watchman. How could they? He was a reminder that death was near. He stank of it. He carried it. He became part of the disease itself in their eyes. Some towns had body collectors, often criminals paid in bread or immunity, but they were few, and as more of them died, the job always circled back to the watchman. In London during the Great Plague of 1348, records show entire districts where the only living men seen walking were the priest and the watchman, one speaking to God, the other hauling corpses by the ankle. And it wasn't just the bodies that haunted him, it was what they left behind. Rooms full of unfinished meals, letters never sent, toys still held by tiny fingers. In one French village, a watchman wrote of entering a home where the entire family had died around the hearth. The fire still smoldered, a roast lay half-carved on the table. The dog barked but didn't attack. He tied the door shut behind him and walked away without looking back. Quarantine wasn't only physical, it was psychological. For the watchman, the world shrank to a map of infected zones, screams in the dark, and the feel of rough rope cutting into his palms. He wasn't allowed to see his own family during plague duty. Many slept in abandoned stalls or barns, wrapped in cloaks that reeked of rot. They washed in river water if they washed at all. And when symptoms appeared, because they always did, there was no help. The cough, the boil, the fever, no one dared come close. Not priests, not healers, not other guards. If a watchman sickened, he was abandoned where he lay. Sometimes a younger recruit was ordered to escort him to the edge of town. Other times they simply nailed his door shut and crossed his name off the payroll. Some watchmen, upon seeing the first signs, walked into the forest. Others jumped into rivers. A few scrawled their names into walls and prayed to be remembered. Most were not. Their belongings were burned, their routes reassigned. The job went on, because the plague never came just once. It returned, again and again, in 1361, in 1374, in 1399. Every generation had its own wave, and every wave had its own crop of forgotten watchmen. They weren't just victims of disease. They were weapons in a war no one understood, against an enemy no one could see. And when the town finally reopened, weeks, months later, there were no celebrations, no honors, no processions. The watchmen who survived were told to clean themselves and report back to duty. Because now that the plague had passed, it was time to deal with the crime wave that always followed. When the plague subsided, and it always did, eventually the town didn't return to normal. It twisted into something harder, angrier, and more dangerous. The death carts were gone, the doors unbarred,
but the streets were lined with silence and suspicion. Survivors looked out from behind curtains, like ghosts unsure whether to step into life again. And into this shattered peace walked the town watchman once more, dragging not corpses this time, but the crushing aftermath of what he had seen and done. He wasn't welcomed back, he was feared. People whispered that the watchmen were touched, not by plague but by death itself, that they had brought the illness with them, that they were cursed. Some mothers warned their children not to speak to them. Some merchants refused them bread. Even the council that had ordered them to guard plague houses now viewed them with the wary eyes of men who had watched others descend into madness. And to be fair, somehow, you don't forget what it feels like to drag a bloated body through a narrow alley with rats scattering from the folds of a once fine tunic. You don't forget the sound of a child coughing behind a door you've just nailed shut. You don't forget the smell of an entire family rotting in one room, their hands clasped in prayer, their eyes staring in different directions. And you certainly don't forget what it's like to survive when all your fellow guards did not. One by one those memories settled. They didn't scream, they whispered. They crept into dreams, made food taste like ash, turned a watchman's patrol into a haunted walk among memories, rather than men. And still the duties resumed. Crime, having paused for pestilence, returned with a vengeance. Thieves starved during lockdown emerged like jackals. Black market traders sold rotting grain or plague cures made from vinegar and rose petals. Some even sold shrouds stolen from the very corpses the watchman had buried. Fights erupted over bread, over blame, over nothing at all. And again the watchman was called to enforce peace. But something had changed. He no longer feared the drunk or the knife or the angry mob. He feared the silence that came after. He feared what he might be asked to do next. And worse, he feared that none of it mattered anymore. After all, the law had failed during the plague. The council had vanished into villas. The priests had fled. The nobles had locked their gates and hired private guards. And the people, those same townsfolk the watchman once tried to protect, had proven just how fast fear could turn into betrayal. There were cases where families bribed guards to say a house was clean, when it wasn't, where doctors sold false bills of health, where neighbors reported each other for fabricated symptoms, just to steal property. And who had to sort through that chaos? The Watchman. In Frankfurt, a report from 1376 noted a spike in false quarantines, where watchmen were instructed to seal homes, not because of plague, but because of political feuds. Accusations were weaponized. A merchant who had wronged the wrong nobles suddenly found his home under plague watch, even if no one inside had sneezed in weeks. Some watchmen resisted, others complied, most simply obeyed, not out of loyalty but exhaustion. Their uniforms were never clean. Their wages, already meager, were docked to cover city expenses. Their families, if they still had them, begged them to quit. But quitting wasn't an option. It never had been. The role wasn't a job. It was a sentence. Once you were marked as a watchman, that was your life, until you were too broken, too sick, or too dead to continue. And yet they were still called upon to act with dignity, to present the illusion of control, to escort plague survivors to court if they owed debt, to stand by the judge while widows argued over wills, to patrol bread lines where half the crowd was ready to riot over moldy loaves, to collect taxes from grieving homes. Yes, even that tax collection. In the months following major outbreaks, towns tried to recover their losses. They taxed grain, taxed imports, taxed funerals. Watchmen were ordered to enforce those collections. Imagine knocking on a door where 5 people died last month, and now you're demanding payment for the burial license. You're not a hero, you're not even a man. You're a function, a talking, rotting limb of a body that no longer knows what it's doing. Some watchmen finally broke. They snapped mid-patrol, attacked merchants, refused orders, or vanished into the hills. One collapsed in a chapel, stripped naked, and claimed he heard the voice of God blaming him for every death. Another set fire to a quarantine house and waited for it to burn down with him still inside. These were not rare events. These were recorded, not in poems or sermons, but in ledger books and tribunal minutes. Clinical, cold, and undeniable. Others didn't go mad. They simply faded. They stopped talking, stopped writing, stopped thinking. They walked their routes like ghosts, nodded at their superiors, avoided eye contact. They drank if they could afford it, slept in barns if they weren't welcome at home. They became shadows in the very city they once served, avoided by all, remembered by none. And through it all, the plague always returned. Every few years, every generation, new names, new strains, new victims, but always the same role, the same orders, the same silence. Guard the house, collect the body, don't let anyone leave. And behind those orders was an understanding: you, Watchman, are already dead. If not in body, then in purpose. If not in purpose, then in spirit. You walk not for justice, nor for duty, but because someone must be seen walking. Because if no one walks the street, then the town must admit that there is nothing left to protect. So the Watchman tightens the cord around his face, lifts the lantern, and moves again through the blackened alleys. The plague is gone, for now, but the town is still sick, and he is the symptom no one dares acknowledge. Chapter 7. Torture chambers and dirty deals. If the plague made the town rot from the outside in, the courts and dungeons rotted it from the inside out. For a watchman, plague duty might have been the most terrifying task, but escorting prisoners to the torture chamber, that was the most soul-shredding, not because of blood, not because of screams, but because it exposed the brutal machinery that sat behind every so-called justice the town claimed to uphold. And worst of all, the watchman didn't just witness it, he greased its gears. Let's get one thing straight. Torture wasn't rare, it was institutional. Most medieval towns had dedicated chambers, sometimes called the lower room, the black vault, or simply the cellar. These weren't dungeons filled with howling lunatics like in fiction. No, they were quiet, cold, and efficient. Small rooms with iron hooks in the ceiling, blood-stained benches, and wooden racks that groaned under pressure. The door to such places was never locked to the watchman. He carried the keys. He brought the bodies in, he read the orders, he stood at the edge of the torchlight while a man's fingernails were peeled away, or a woman was forced to confess beneath the weight of a heavy board and slowly poured water. And if the victim died, the record simply read, "Confession incomplete." In towns like Augsburg and Rouen, there were entire protocols for interrogation. Torture wasn't meant to be a punishment, it was a tool to extract truth, but it didn't extract truth, it extracted pain. And the watchman, whether he wanted to or not, was complicit in delivering it. He held wrists, he gagged mouths, he fetched the irons from the coals, and when it was done he dragged the broken husk back to the cell. Most of the accused weren't murderers or traitors, they were poor, or foreign, or outspoken. Some were simply unlucky, named in a whispered rumor, caught near a crime scene, or arrested to balance the books of justice. After a high-profile theft, it didn't matter if they were guilty, it only mattered that someone paid. And who made the deals? The same men who smiled during daylight council meetings, the magistrates, the guild leaders, the priests with rings heavy from tithes. They decided who needed to confess and when. They gave orders wrapped in phrases like extract clarity, or ensure compliance. But the violence was always left to the hands of others, to the torturer, and to the watchman. In many towns these roles overlapped. A torturer wasn't always a professional. Sometimes he was a butcher, trained to cut flesh efficient. Sometimes he was a former soldier with strong arms, and no pension. Sometimes when no one else volunteered, the duty fell to the senior night watch. He might receive extra bread or coin, he might not, but the damage lasted either way. One ledger from Ghent, in 1442, lists a watchman named Corbin, who assisted in the extraction of confession from 4 suspects. 2 died, 1 recanted, 1 fled the town after release. Corbin's only reward, a note in the margin, performed adequately. Torture wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Prisoners were often kept in total darkness, deprived of food, made to listen to other victims scream, told their families had been arrested too. And the watchman, he delivered the threat. He stood by as interrogators lied through their teeth, promising mercy that never came, pretending to be on the prisoner's side, only to betray them minutes later. You might think a watchman could refuse. He couldn't. Orders from the council were absolute. Disobedience meant dismissal, or worse, reassignment to the worst patrol routes, with no partner and no backup. Some who objected to the cruelty were themselves accused of sympathy with the accused, or even heretical tendencies. And once suspicion landed on a man in that chamber, he didn't come back out. One of the darkest realities was how information was bought, not found. If a wealthy merchant suspected his rival of smuggling, he might pay for an investigation. The council would instruct the watch to detain the rival's apprentice. No trial, no hearing, just a name, a location, and a rope. Days later, under the agony of the rack, that apprentice would confess to anything: smuggling, sorcery, sedition. And just like that, the merchant's competitor vanished, and the book stayed balanced. Even more chilling were the cases involving women accused of witchcraft. These weren't cackling spellcasters, they were healers, widows, midwives, and the Watchman was the first face they saw when the accusation came. He dragged them from their homes. He stood by as their hair was shaved, their clothes torn, their bodies examined for the devil's mark. He lit the torches while they screamed their innocence into stone walls that didn't care. One journal from an English village describes a watchman who escorted 3 women to the truth chamber over the course of 1 week. All 3 were accused of cursing livestock. 1 died in custody. 1 was publicly whipped. 1, a healer, confessed to being taught charms by her grandmother and was hanged the following morning. The watchman wrote in his margin, "All I could do was carry them. I did not speak, and yet silence is complicity." Many watchmen knew this. Some broke under the guilt, others doubled down, convincing themselves it was all for the greater good, that the pain had purpose, that justice required sacrifice, that order was worth the suffering, and a few, just a few, began to enjoy it. These were the ones who rose fast, who earned trust, who were promoted to lead patrols or given access to courtrooms. They became the men who trained others, and so the cycle continued. A system of dirty deals, forced confessions, broken bones, and men in grey cloaks, dragging lanterns through shadowed halls, not to seek justice, but to enforce fear, to keep the machine turning. The town slept above it all, unaware or uninterested. So long as crimes were punished and rumors suppressed, no one asked who paid the real cost. But the watchman knew. He smelled it on his hands. He carried it in his shoulders. He heard it in his sleep, because beneath every quiet square and cobbled street was a room with iron hooks, and beneath every iron hook stood a man just doing his job. When a watchman walked out of the torture chamber and back into the light of the street, he didn't walk taller, he walked slower. He didn't feel justice had been done. He felt stain, not always with blood, but with a residue far worse. Doubt. Doubt in the men who gave the orders. Doubt in the words he wrote in his nightly reports. Doubt in the city itself. Yet the world above the chamber carried on. Market stalls were restocked. Bells rang for church. Children played in courtyards stained by last week's lashings. And all the while the accused, those who survived, hobbled through the same streets, bearing scars like whispered confessions, etched into skin. Some had confessed just to make the pain stop. Others hadn't confessed at all, and were punished anyway, because the town couldn't afford to appear weak. And where was the watchman? Back at his post, watching, always watch. Many towns had secrets buried beneath the stone, cellars converted into investigation rooms, wells bricked up to hide evidence, tunnels used to smuggle prisoners away from public view. In places like Avignon, Bruges and Erfurt, there were entire blocks where no one dared live, for the air was said to still carry the echoes of screams, long silenced. But echo or not, the memory remained sharp in the minds of those who had walked the chambers, lantern in hand, eyes avert. Some watchmen tried to compartmentalize. "It's not my job to question," they would mutter, only to carry out orders. But even they flinched when a child was accused of theft and strung up for questioning, or when a midwife was tortured for giving herbs to a grieving mother, or when a foreigner, unable to speak the local tongue, was beaten until he nodded yes to charges he didn't understand. There was no appeal process, no lawyers, only pain and silence. It wasn't just physical torture that scarred the soul, it was what came after. When victims returned to their neighborhoods, they were pariahs. Their shops were avoided, their children mocked, their marriages strained or shattered. And what did the town do for them? Nothing. Their suffering served a purpose, proof that justice worked. Their broken fingers, their slurred speech, their hollow eyes, these were meant to remind the rest to behave. And the watchman was their chaperone. He escorted them home, sometimes helping them walk. He delivered court scrolls to their doors, outlining fines or restrictions. He was sent to check that they remained within city limits, to confirm they hadn't resumed their suspicious behavior. He knew them by name, knew their faces before and after, knew which ones stopped speaking, knew which ones stopped eating, knew which ones were later found hanging from rafters. In some cases, the very same watchman who had escorted them into the torture chamber was ordered to bury them afterward. In Nuremberg, one such man, Gregor, wrote in his journal that he had helped remove the same prisoner from the chamber 3 times. He confessed, Gregor wrote, but they said it was not full. On the 4th visit, the man didn't wait. Gregor was then instructed to bury him without rite in the woods behind the town's east wall. His only payment was a loaf of bread and a thin pair of gloves. The journal ends soon after, but torture wasn't always done to extract confessions. Sometimes it was just retribution masquerading as justice. If a town had suffered embarrassment, a botched arrest, a public insult, a stolen relic, someone had to pay whether they were guilty or not. That's when the backroom deals became clearest. The Watchman might receive a new list of names, suspected conspirators, potential informants, friends of the accused. He would knock on doors in the early hours, never stating a reason, only showing a scroll marked with a wax seal. Most people didn't resist, they knew better. They gathered a few belongings and followed him, head down, past neighbors who pretended not to see. The chamber door opened again, and again, and again. Some watchmen asked themselves, what if it were me? But they already knew. If they ever spoke out about a false confession, a botched execution, a bribe, they would be next. That was the rule no one wrote down, yet everyone understood. So they swallowed the bile, they walked the line, they kept the system running. Because behind every quiet court session, behind every nod from a judge, behind every name scribbled into parchment, was a man with a lantern, a key and 100 unspoken regrets. And yet townsfolk still pointed at the Watchman and said he keeps us safe. Safe from what? From sin, from themselves. No, safe from seeing the truth. Because as long as the Watchman did his job, hauling the accused, lighting the torches, standing by as the lash fell, no one else had to look. The shopkeeper didn't have to wonder why his competitor vanished. The priest didn't have to question why a widow confessed to devilry. The magistrate didn't have to admit he ordered a punishment before the trial even began. They all slept better knowing the Watchman would walk the halls of pain for them, that he would descend the stairs into the stone silence, that he would absorb the screams and bury them in his bones, until one day he disappeared too, and was replaced, quickly, without question, because no town can function without someone to carry the burden of its sins, and no sin is heavier than torture performed in the name of order.
Chapter 8. In the medieval world, there was one institution even more powerful than the sword of a noble or the scroll of a magistrate. The church. It rang the bells, wrote the laws, whispered in the ears of kings. It anointed war, sanctioned punishment, and promised salvation, but only to those who obeyed. And for the town watchman, that meant obeying not just man's law, but God's law, at least as interpreted by the men who wore robes, rings, and a smug smile behind the pulpit. But the truth was, God rarely walked the night watch. The church preached mercy by day, but demanded cruelty by dusk. It called for confession, then punished those who gave it. And while it claimed to protect the innocent, it handed out accusations like bread on a feast day, especially when fear was in fashion. The Black Death, blame the heretics. A failed harvest, blame the witches. A lightning strike that destroyed the chapel roof. Surely someone had sinned nearby, and who had to deliver these charges? Who had to knock on doors in the name of divine inquiry? The Watchman. He didn't write the accusations. He didn't craft the sermons. He didn't believe the rumors, but he delivered the scrolls, escorted the suspects, enforced the curfews. He stood outside the cathedral at midnight while monks recited incantations. He patrolled holy relics during processions, and was beaten by pilgrims when a relic failed to produce a miracle. He lit the fires beneath accused heretics, and was spat on by the crowd, who both feared and loathed him for carrying out the church's most feared work. There was no honor in it, just dread, and that dread seeped in from every direction. You see, the church didn't just wield spiritual authority, it controlled information, it ran the schools, it copied the books, it even decided what could be read aloud in public. So when a watchman doubted the righteousness of his orders, he had nowhere to turn, no higher doctrine to appeal to. Scripture had already been weaponized. In fact, the watchmen often couldn't read at all. Most were unlettered. They memorized laws by hearing them repeated in court or in sermons, and the church used that ignorance to its advantage. It made sins out of disobedience and virtue out of blind loyalty. It told the watchman he was part of a holy chain, that by guarding the streets he was guarding God's kingdom, that each time he dragged a drunk from the cathedral steps or forced a beggar to move along, he was upholding sacred order. But deep down, the watchman knew better. He saw what happened behind those sacred doors. He saw the priests visiting brothels in the early hours, faces hidden beneath cloaks. He heard the whispers of altar boys who flinched at the sound of their master's voice. He found the discarded wine jugs, the torn pages from Psalms stuffed into alleyways, the broken rosaries trampled beneath the boots of men who preached humility and practiced gluttony. But he said nothing. He had no power to speak, and if he did, he would be accused himself, because to question a man of the cloth was to question God's will, and that was dangerous ground. It wasn't just dangerous for him, it was dangerous for anyone he knew. Wives disappeared, sons were exiled, neighbors fell under suspicion. In Florence, a watchman who filed a complaint against a local friar for theft was later accused of spreading impure thoughts. His entire family was put under observation. His home was burned, the friar was promoted, the scroll that had held the complaint lost in a fire. So the watchman learned to be quiet, to nod when the bishop passed, to bow when the priest glared, to walk slowly past the convent where women cried at night. He learned to remove his own thoughts like rusted armor to survive, because in a town ruled by fear and faith in equal measure, independent thought was treason, and it wasn't just the elite clerics who wielded this power. Even the town's common parish priests held sway. They controlled absolution. If a watchman refused a church duty or objected to a religious arrest, his sins were withheld. He couldn't take communion, he couldn't marry, he couldn't bury his loved ones on holy ground. These punishments were spiritual, but in the medieval mind they were worse than death. To die with sins unshriven was to burn. To bury a child outside the chapel gate was to curse them to wander the afterlife. And so the watchman served, even when it made his stomach turn, even when he knew he was being used, even when he was sent to arrest someone whose only crime was reading a different gospel. Because he wasn't just cursed by the church, he was bound to it, and no iron shackle was heavier than the one wrapped in scripture. But the townspeople didn't see that chain. They only saw the man standing by the whipping post, the man who dragged their neighbor away in the night, the man who stood guard while the bishop's favorite merchant extorted the desperate. They didn't blame the church, or the council, or the nobles. They blamed the watchman, and so he was hated, mocked in taverns, spat at during feast days, ignored when injured. If his wife went to market, prices doubled. If his child asked to play, other children were pulled away. Don't talk to them, mothers whispered. They live with darkness, not because of what he believed, but because of what he enforced. And so night after night he walked alone, between cathedrals and cesspits, between sermons and screams, between absolution and abomination, carrying out God's justice, or at least man's version of. And in the silence of alleyways lit only by flickering torchlight, he asked a question that no priest ever answered. Who guards the soul of the watchman? To understand just how isolated the watchman had become, you must remember that in a medieval town, the church was everywhere and nowhere. Its presence loomed from steeples and echoed in bells, but its justice lived in whispers in incense-choked confessionals, and in edicts no man dared question. For the watchman this made faith not a source of comfort, but a tightrope walk between ritual and he was expected to enforce God's law, yet excluded from its graces. He stood watch outside the chapel doors during high feast days, guarding relics too holy for his eyes, blocking beggars too filthy for the pews. He was the invisible boundary between sacred and profane, not because he was trusted, because he was expendable. In many towns, watchmen were barred from receiving communion while on plague duty, not out of caution, but out of suspicion. They were considered unclean, too close to death, and even after the plague passed, the stain remained. One watchman in Tours recorded in a margin note that he had not taken the sacrament in over 2 years, despite pleading with 3 priests. Their response? Better to keep death outside the temple. The hypocrisy cut deep. These were the same priests who ordered him to escort prisoners, to deliver church fines, to oversee the public penance of women accused of lust or witchcraft. They handed him the rope, then stepped back into the sanctity of the altar, while he dragged the condemned through the mud. Yet when it came time for blessings or rites, he was forgotten. Sometimes his family paid the price. Wives of watchmen were often viewed with suspicion. They were thought to be privy to secrets too dark, too unclean. Some were accused of being witches, others simply couldn't marry into better stations. A girl betrothed to a watchman's son might be pulled away by her father. We don't tie our blood to those who work with shadows, and shadows were all the watchman had. The church processions were a cruel reminder of this divide. During feast days, holy relics were paraded through town. The thigh bone of a saint, a vial of blood, a crucifix said to weep during storms. Townspeople lined the streets, singing hymns, throwing petals. Children reached out in awe, but the watchman, he wasn't allowed to participate. He walked behind the relic bearers, not as a pilgrim, but as a wall, shielding the holy from the low, fending off those considered too sinful to stand near the divine. He was close to God's treasures, but never welcome to them. This division grew sharper during times of crisis. When a blight struck or a fire ravaged half the town, the church called for prayer and punishment. It declared the town had sinned, that someone among them had angered the divine. The watchman was sent out to collect the suspected sinners, the drunk, the loud, the and in this effort, truth was a casualty. If enough names were collected, if enough scapegoats were shamed publicly, the town could claim redemption. One German record from 1383 tells of a drought during which the church blamed unrepentant gamblers and the watchmen were ordered to arrest men who lingered outside taverns and escort them to the square for forced confession. Some had done nothing, others had merely borrowed coin or been too loud in prayer. It didn't matter, a town needed guilt, and the watchman carried it, house to house. But the church wasn't just interested in public sin, it was obsessed with private thought. Watch for heresy, the priest said. Watch for doubt. If a merchant failed to attend mass, report it. If a widow questioned the fairness of her penance, take her. If a child asked why the bishop lived in a manor while they slept hungry, call it spiritual rebellion. The watchman became a spy, a listener, a recorder of whispers, and the people knew, even when he meant no harm, even when he was just walking his route. The sight of the watchman turned heads, doors closed, voices dropped. He wasn't just feared, he was despised, because he was the mouthpiece of the system, not the noble, not the priest, not the tax collector, the man in the mud-stained coat with the flickering lantern, and the tired eyes. He was the one who showed up in the middle of the night, who asked quiet questions, who returned again the next day, not with comfort, but with orders. And even if he didn't believe the orders, he carried them out, because he had to, because to hesitate was to invite suspicion. Because if he didn't enforce the will of the church, someone else would enforce it on him. Even silence was risk. In Avignon, a watchman was accused of heresy for failing to arrest a man caught preaching outside the cathedral. He later claimed he hadn't heard the man's words, only that he'd been afraid to intervene alone. It didn't matter. The bishop declared that inaction in the face of blasphemy is equal to participation. The watchman was removed. No one knows what happened to him next. So the others learned, do not pause, do not think, do not pray too loudly, do not linger too long at the altar, do not show mercy, do not question doctrine, and above all do not look the priests in the eye, because they smiled with a kindness that felt like a blade, and in that smile was the same power that had turned you, the watchman, into something less than a man, a tool, a disposable hand of a god you no longer trusted, but whom you served anyway. Because in the medieval town salvation was never free, and someone had to pay the toll. Chapter 9. Sleep. Sleep was the one luxury the medieval watchman never had. Not truly, not the deep dream-heavy kind that heals and restores. His sleep came in fragments, stolen hours, brief blinks, jolts away. It was the kind of sleep that crept in with shame, curled up like a dog under a bench, and was chased off again by the tolling of bells, or the screams of a distant alley. And even in the rare moments he lay flat, muscles slack and eyes closed, his mind kept walking. Because being a watchman wasn't just about being tired, it was about becoming fatigue itself, a living ghost, dragging the chains of responsibility through cobbled streets and splintered floorboards, always watching, never resting. The shift system was broken from the start. Officially, towns claimed to rotate night watches, allowing men to rest after a few shifts. But in reality the poor always served more. If you had coin you paid to avoid the duty, if you had connections you were unavailable. But the man with no land, no family and no voice, he took your place, again, and again, and again. In small towns with barely a dozen appointed watchmen, some men worked 5 or 6 nights in a row, 12 hours at a time, only to be summoned in the morning for questioning or delivery duties. Double shifts weren't they were expected. One record from York in 1408 describes a man named Elias, who completed a 6-day stretch of night duty with only 4 hours of sleep between each patrol. On the 7th day he collapsed into a merchant's cart, broke 2 ribs,
and was fined for disrupting commerce. That's right, he was fined for fainting. In larger cities, patrol routes were longer and more complicated. Some included bridges, gatehouses, graveyards, and slums. Others snaked through market squares and under aqueducts. Each route took hours, and the farther you walked, the more likely your return was met not with rest, but with new instructions. Deliver this message, fetch the magistrate, help dig out the bakery after the collapse. No one waited for you to nap, and forget about beds. Most watchmen didn't have homes of their own. If they did, they were cramped one-room shacks, shared with a coughing parent, or 3 squabbling children. There was no silence, no space. Some slept in stables, others curled up on church steps or in unused guard posts. Their cloaks served as blankets, their belts as pillows, and if they were lucky, a baker might let them doze beside the ovens for a bit of warmth. But warmth came with risk. Falling asleep on duty was a crime in many towns, punishable by fine, flogging, or dismissal. And dismissal in a town where every job was filled by a man more desperate than you meant starvation. So the watchman walked, even when his legs ached and his head lolled forward mid-step. He walked in circles if he had to. He slapped his face, bit his tongue, anything to stay awake. And yet sleep still came at the worst times. There are reports of watchmen found dozing against tavern walls, their lanterns guttered, their clubs dropped in the mud. In some cases they were beaten by criminals, in others robbed by children, and sometimes the consequences were deadlier. One chilling account from 1392 Paris tells of a watchman who fell asleep at a gate. A fire broke out in the lower quarter during his nap. It spread to 17 homes. 2 children died. The man was stripped of his post, flogged, and branded with the town's crest on his shoulder, so that no one would ever trust him again. He died of infection weeks later. But it wasn't always about fear or punishment. Sometimes it was just the cumulative weight of existence. The food was terrible. Dry bread, root stew, maybe salt pork if a merchant owed you a favor. Water was often unsafe. Ale was safer, but dulled the senses. And still the watchman drank it, because anything was better than the hollow fog that grew inside the skull when you hadn't slept in 2 days, and were now being told to walk through the butcher's alley because someone thought they heard a scream. The emotional toll was worse. Fatigue isn't just physical, it eats at the mind. It frays thought. A tired watchman second-guessed everything. Was that a scream or a cat? Did that man just drop something, or was it a weapon? Should I investigate or keep walking? Hesitation could kill you, so you learned to act on instinct. Fast, brutal, final. And when you acted wrong, when the thief turned out to be a hungry child, when the witch you dragged from her home was an old woman mumbling prayers in her sleep, you didn't get time to process it, you just kept walking. Sleep became a memory, a luxury seen from a distance, but never touched. Some tried to fight back. One watchman in Lübeck organized a petition for structured rest shifts. He demanded proper cots, blankets, and rotating duty cycles. It gained signatures. It was presented to the council. The council laughed. If the night is too dark for you, they wrote in reply, perhaps you should ask the moon for comfort. The man was reassigned to gate patrol. In winter, another slipped into madness, walked into the town square one dawn, and sat cross-legged, unmoving, whispering the names of every street he'd ever patrolled. They dragged him to a convent. He died 2 days later. Even dreams became twisted. The few times the watchman did sleep, he dreamed of of doors that wouldn't open, of people screaming his name and vanishing before he could reach them. His rest was never restful. It was guilt, replayed, fatigue, compounded, and still he got up, because the city demanded it, because the silence between footsteps was worse than the ache, because someone had to carry the burden of sleeplessness, so the rest of the town could close its eyes and pretend things were under control. And so once again, the watchman tightened his belt, picked up his lantern, and stepped into the dark, not because he was ready, but because readiness was a lie he could no longer afford not to believe. Sleep deprivation wasn't just an inconvenience for the watchman. It was a slow form of destruction. It chipped away at judgment first, then memory, then humanity. What remained was a body still moving, still obeying, but no longer truly alive. The medieval watchman didn't just miss sleep. He became the absence of it. His eyes saw but didn't register. His hands moved without meaning. He functioned like a lantern near its end, flickering, unsteady, moments from blackness. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Chronic fatigue twisted the mind. Some watchmen began hallucinating. They claimed to see cloaked figures following them, heard voices in empty streets, felt eyes staring from walls that held no windows. These weren't ghost stories, these were symptoms, the result of months, years, even of fractured rest and uninterrupted tension. The watchman must have missed something. A thief escaped capture. The watchman must have nodded off. Fires, riots, brawls. Any disaster during the night became the failure of the man who hadn't slept in days. Never mind that he was sent out without food, without support, with a torch stub and a rotting club. The town demanded perfection from men who were barely coherent, and still the orders kept coming. Patrol the western wall, a sheep's been taken. They're working late again. Escort the priest to the bishop's house. He fears the dark. No concern for how long you'd been awake. No care for whether your feet bled through your shoes. If you were seen yawning, you were accused of disrespect. If you leaned against a post, a shopkeeper might report you for dereliction. There was no winning. To survive, you had to remain in motion, and motion itself became madness. A watchman's gait changed over time. His walk became uneven. His back bent, not just from weight, but from imbalance caused by exhaustion. Some dragged their feet, not out of laziness, but because lifting them was a luxury. One German observer in the early 15th century wrote, "The guard passed by like a sack of tired bones tied together by duty."
Some tried to resist the fatigue with stimulants, though medieval options were limited. Strong ale was common, but dulled too much. Bitter herbs like horehound or wormwood were chewed to stay alert, though they wreaked havoc on the stomach. One city experimented with vinegar and garlic-soaked rags tied around the neck, claimed to shock the blood awake. It didn't work. Many passed out anyway, reeking of failure and spice. What about rest between shifts? Non-existent. Watchmen were often pulled into other duties, escorting criminals, delivering messages, supervising hangings. Even when they were off, they were on call. If a riot broke out or a noble's property was damaged, the town bell rang and all able-bodied watchmen, rested or not, were summoned. One could be asleep for 10 minutes, only to be roused by a hammering fist. Up. They're fighting again near the mill. The long-term toll was devastating. Teeth fell out, legs swelled, eyes grew bloodshot and sunk deep into the skull. Some men began speaking to themselves aloud even on patrol. Others lost the ability to focus on speech, hearing commands, but not processing them. Their minds filled with white noise, static, street names and orders, over and over like a broken prayer. Sleep deprivation also destroyed relationships. Watchmen weren't home enough to raise their children, weren't lucid enough to love their wives. When they did return, they were irritable, distant, empty. Their families tiptoed around them, fearing the outbursts, the blank stares, the deep, restless silences. Some wives left, others stayed out of obligation, but the home was no longer a refuge. It was a second prison, one with smaller windows and colder beds. The town rarely noticed. To them, the watchman was a fixture, like a torch post or a signboard. Something expected, not someone. If one fell asleep and was stabbed during the night, his route was reassigned the next morning. If he vanished entirely, rumors lasted a day or two. He was always tired, someone might mutter. Probably wandered off, but a few did more than wander. A few snapped. One threw his lantern through the council chamber window and screamed that the night itself was watching him. Another fell asleep during a patrol, only to wake and believe the sun was a fire sent to punish him. He ran into the river, weighted down by his own armor. Another curled beneath a wagon and refused to emerge, whispering that sleep was finally safe there. He stayed until the merchant left the city, unaware he was carrying a broken man beneath his goods. And then there were the suicides. Some were quiet, a noose behind the barracks, a blade in the woods. Others were theatrical. One climbed the bell tower and leapt, shouting, "Let someone else watch now." His blood soaked the very square he once patrolled. The town cleaned it by noon. No service was held, and so the cycle continued. New men filled the shoes, new names on the roster, new feet on the same path. But the path hadn't changed. It was still lined with shadows that no torch could banish, still echoing with the cries of unseen pain, still waiting to consume the next man foolish or desperate enough to believe that order was worth the price of sleep. And deep down, every watchman knew the truth. It wasn't that the city never slept. It was that it needed someone else to stay awake forever. Chapter 10. Broken Bones and Forgotten Graves. There is no statue for the watchman, no stained glass depiction of his weary form beneath the arches of the town chapel, no candle flickering beside a wall etched with his name. The medieval town glorified saints, martyrs, kings and soldiers, but the man who gave his life to quiet, ceaseless service, he died in silence and in pieces, because by the time most watchmen reached their end, their bodies were already ruined. Years of patrols had worn down the joints, knees ground like stones, fingers bent inwards from cold and repeated blows, teeth long gone, eyes clouded from smoke, poor diet or the endless strain of squinting through fog, and bones broke regularly, not in grand battles or during heroic arrests, but in alleys, gutters, cellar stairs. A misplaced step, a slippery cobblestone, a shove from a drunken merchant, and a wrist snap, a rib cracked, a spine twisted and never healed. Some limped for years afterward, others never stood up again, and there was no compensation, no healer sent by the town. A crippled watchman was simply retired, usually without pay. If he had family, they cared for him, if they could afford to. If he had none, he begged, or died. In Ghent, a record from 1394 notes that a former watchman named Peter was found dead outside the walls with a broken foot and a half-frozen loaf of bread in his coat. The cause of death was listed as lack of means. The town buried him in a pauper's grave. Others weren't even buried at all. During plagues or times of economic stress, the dead were triage. Nobles and clergy first, merchants next, laborers after. The watchman, if unclaimed, was often left for mass graves or quick disposal in charred pits meant for criminals. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had no one powerful enough to argue for more. Forgotten in death, just as he was in life. This forgetting wasn't always malicious. It was systemic, built into the bones of the medieval world. The role of watchman was designed to be invisible, thankless, temporary. He wasn't meant to last, and most didn't. Few lived past 50, most died before 40. Their deaths rarely made records, unless they were violent. A stabbing in the slums, a beating gone too far, a building collapse during a rescue attempt. These earned brief mentions in city scrolls. One of the watch fell tonight. That was the language, clinical, detached. He wasn't a man, he was a unit of labor, a body that could be replaced before sundown. And he always was. The next day, another man would take his place. Sometimes younger, sometimes older, always poorer. There was never a shortage of desperation in a medieval town. Hunger ensured the roster stayed full. But even in death, the watchman worked. His body became a lesson, a warning. Children were told, stay inside or the night man will take you. But they weren't talking about the living one. They meant the ghosts, the spirits of those who died on duty, whose souls had not been blessed with proper rite, whose bones still lay beneath the gatehouse, or under the bridge, or in the collapsed stable where no one would dig. Superstitions grew. People believed that the towns cursed their own guardians, that for every unjust beating, every wrongful arrest, the spirits of the wronged followed the watchman home, that every time a man was punished for a crime he didn't commit, the watchman who delivered him would sick, that if a watchman stood too long in one place, he would hear the names of the dead whispered in the wind. Did the watchmen believe it? Some did. They began carrying charms, iron nails, twine knots, herbs wrapped in cloth, not because they believed in magic, but because it gave them something to hold, something to blame when the nightmares came, something to explain why their bones ached, even when they hadn't fallen, why their lanterns sputtered near certain alleys, why they sometimes heard footsteps that didn't echo their own, and yet they still walked. Every night, even as their bodies broke, even as their minds frayed, even as they watched their comrades vanish, one by one, because there was no end to the duty, only collapse. And when collapse came, it wasn't grand. No procession, no speech, just a body found slumped against a wall, still holding a cudgel, or lying curled beneath a stairwell, clutching their own coat like a shroud. Some were discovered days later after the smell drew attention. Others were never found at all, only missed when their replacements were slow to arrive. In one especially bitter winter, a small town near the Pyrenees recorded 3 watchmen freezing to death on patrol within a week. The council's response was not to improve conditions. It was to rotate routes more frequently and require men to bring their own fuel. One letter read, "We mourn their passing but remind all that duty persists regardless of weather." It was the epitaph carved invisibly over every watchman's life. Duty persists, even when the man carrying it no longer can,
even when his bones crack like frozen wood, even when his name is lost to time, his grave unmarked, his story untold. When the town wept for its martyrs, it lit candles in cathedrals. When it honored saints, it rang bells, burned incense, and painted their faces in gold leaf. But when a watchman died on a frozen wall, in a collapsing stairwell, beneath the cudgel of a thief or the boot of a noble, there were no tears, just cold ash and silence. His memory was not sanctified, it was scrubbed away like grime from a doorway. Because to remember the watchman was to confront the ugliness of the system, and medieval towns had no appetite for guilt. The few belongings he left behind, his splintered club, his wax-stained lantern, the worn leather pouch with a crust of bread inside, were usually taken by the next man in line. No inheritance, no heirlooms. If he had children, they rarely inherited anything but his reputation. If he had a wife, she returned to the mercy of her family or the market. No pension, no support, no apology, sometimes not even a body. There were stories of watchmen who disappeared on foggy nights. No trail, no blood, just absence. It was whispered that they had been taken by spirit. More likely they'd been dragged into an alley and buried in the dung pit by men who feared witnesses. Their lanterns might later be found in pawn shops, their cloaks burned for warmth. The city did not investigate. Even when bones surfaced during foundation digging or street repairs, they were reburied quickly without rite or remark. Old remains, they'd say, commoners, perhaps. No need to delay the construction of a tavern or disrupt market trade with inconvenient history. That erasure was systemic, intentional, built into the parchment of policy and the mortar of stone. Medieval towns liked their heroes tall and distant. Lords who rode off to war, saints who bled prettily, merchants who built churches, the men who kept the alleys clean with sweat and fear, who kept fires from spreading and blades from returning bloody, who bore witness to the very worst of humanity so others could sleep. They were too real to be honored, too dirty, too inconvenient, so their names faded. One list from a southern German town records 50 years of magistrates, 20 years of aldermen, and 3 years of rat catchers, but no names of night watchmen, only their numbers. 10 watchmen to patrol Western Quarter, 4 reassigned to gate detail. No faces, no stories, no end, just data. And yet for all that was denied them in death, they gave more in life than most ever noticed. They were the first to arrive at fires, the last to leave riots, the only ones who checked if the crying behind a wall was a child or a woman, or something else entirely. They carried dying men from gutters, broke up brawls between guilds, covered corpses with their cloaks because no one else would, and not out of glory but because someone had to. Always, someone had to. Some might wonder why they didn't rebel, why they didn't throw down their clubs and walk away. But rebellion requires strength, and the watchman had spent his strength already on sleepless nights, broken fingers, lashes from courts that never thanked him. By the end he had no fire left to burn, just embers, and silence. There are rare cases scattered through fragmented archives, where a town did honor a fallen watchman. One scroll from Bruges speaks of a man who died pulling 3 children from a burning granary. A small plaque was placed on the wall in his name, but decades later that wall was knocked down for a bakery. The plaque was never rehung. In another case, a watchman who died during plague duty was buried in the churchyard after a priest insisted he had served like a saint. The townsfolk protested, claiming he was cursed. The grave was eventually moved. The priest was reassigned. The message was clear. The role of the watchman was not to be remembered, it was to remember others, their crimes, their patterns, He kept the stories the town refused to write down. He knew who beat his wife behind closed shutters, who paid the brothel to stay open on feast days, who left the tannery before the fire, and yet he never told, not because he was loyal but because he knew it wouldn't matter. He wasn't just forgotten, he was made to be forgotten. His life was shaped by duty, his limbs by toil, his mind by sleep-deprived obedience, and when he finally lay down, truly finally, beneath soil too shallow and stones too rough, there was no one left who knew his face, only footsteps on the street above, only laughter echoing through the alleys he once patrolled, only torches lit by hands younger than his, gripping the same old rusted keys, the same thankless weight, the same fate, because the town always needs a watch but never remembers his name. And so ends the long, lonely walk of the medieval town watchman. No banners, no songs, no rest, just the slow rhythm of boots on cold stone, the echo of a duty no one thanked him for, and the weight of a lantern whose flame never truly lit the path ahead. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a villain, he was simply there when no one else wanted to be, guarding a town that resented him, enforcing a law that betrayed him, serving a system that erased him, and yet night after night he walked. And now, centuries later, perhaps it's time someone remembered. Thank you for walking that path with me tonight. If your eyes grow heavy now, may your dreams be gentler than his nights ever were. You've been listening to The Drowsy Historian, where history doesn't roar, it murmurs. Sleep well,